my joint capacity as both the Escapist's movie critic and general geek culture man about town, I consider it part of my overall function to use my joint areas of quote-unquote expertise to help other folks who might be more fluent in one than the other see more eye to eye with each other. As such, it occurs to me that when movie critics like myself talk about the different eras and systems in Hollywood history, readers and viewers who aren't necessarily movie folks themselves may not know exactly what we're referring to, and that doesn't help either of us. I've dedicated a few columns to bridging this gap in the past, but this particular part begs for a visual presentation. A very, very, very condensed reference guide to the history of Hollywood. Alright, first off, the American movie industry is generally called Hollywood as a geographical shorthand. These days, the actual industry is spread throughout multinational conglomerates worldwide, but in the early 1900s, a group of businessmen in the booming motion picture industry all set up shop in the same basic favorable region, a largely undeveloped Southern California suburb called Hollywood. See, back on the East Coast, Thomas Edison's Motion Picture Patents Company Trust owned most of the patents on filmmaking equipment and imposed heavy fees and restrictions on movie makers. But the West Coast's Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals wasn't big on patent law enforcement, so a ton of early film talent simply packed up and moved west. This was the birth of what was called the studio system. Today, the term movie studio is basically a term of art to describe corporate entities dedicated to movie making, but back then it was meant quite literally. A studio was the professional space in which a photographer took his photos, and Hollywood's movie companies saw themselves as a writ-large version of simply that. Each studio was a separate company unto itself, with its own personal sets, locations, equipment, and crews. Most major actors worked under contract for only specific studios, although sharing them wasn't unheard of. The Hollywood studio system rose during the tail end of the silent era, but really came into being with the jazz singer and the advent of sound. That period, extending from the late 1920s to the mid-1950s, is generally referred to as the studio era or the Golden Age, with movie making utterly dominated by the Big Five studios of MGM, Warner Brothers, Fox, Paramount, and RKO, and the major minors of Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. During this period, the Hollywood studios dominated not only the American film industry, but really the entire world film industry. Yes, there were similar arrangements in Europe and Asia, but none of them could compete economically with the juggernaut that had sprung up out of nowhere in Southern California. The studios didn't just have the money, talent, and manpower all locked up under contract, they engaged in monopolistic business practices, ironically not all that dissimilar from the Edison tactics their predecessors had fled from in the first place, to ensure their profitability. They didn't just own the facilities that made the movies, they owned some of the theater chains where those movies would be shown. A business practice known as block booking, in which a theater was forced to exhibit a studio's less noteworthy films if they wanted a print of the popular one, also helped keep profits high and tidy. And while you can use a lot of unkind words to describe the way the business side of the studios operated in the so-called Golden Age, it's hard to argue with the results. These guys were brutal taskmasters and often ruthlessly cynical corporate operators, but they knew how to squeeze results from the talent. Some of the most iconic moments in the history of both cinema and modern culture itself originated in this era, thanks both to the artistic power of the movies themselves and the sheer magnitude of effort the studios exerted to spread their existence over the popular culture. But if you're getting the sense that a system this well-rigged just kinda had to be against the law, well, you'd have been right. In the landmark 1948 federal antitrust case United States versus Paramount Pictures Incorporated, the United States Supreme Court ruled that practices like block booking and the studios owning theaters violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And just like that, the age of the studios controlling the exhibition and making of movies was over. For the first time in decades, the iron grip of the Big Five had begun to loosen. But while the Paramount case was the big all-at-once blow to the studio era, it wasn't what ultimately brought the whole thing down. No, that process was slower and more insidious. Hollywood had expected, like every other non-essential industry in the aftermath of World War II, to be staring down a massive windfall of cash from a booming middle class eager to remind themselves of their own financial independence through the consumption of entertainment goods. But Hollywood didn't foresee that it would face a competitor for those dollars unlike any they'd ever faced before, one that outmatched them so pervasively that the conflict and the studio's own refusal to adapt to it would bring the whole thing crashing down around itself. I'm talking, of course, about television. We'll talk about how that worked out next week. Here, then, is the dirty little not-so-secret of the so-called Golden Age of Hollywood, which, as we covered last time, extends roughly from the mid-1920s to the early 1950s. The movies that everyone remembers from that era weren't precisely where Hollywood was making most of its money. See, while the studios were interested in making accomplished, memorable works of art, the lion's share of the money-making output were so-so, kinda average, not particularly memorable films. Now, that's not to say that any of those movies were bad, necessarily, often far from it, but what they weren't was challenging or impactful. They were safe, agreeable, middlebrow pablum aimed at middle-class moms and dads on their night out. The other big source of cheap, steady revenue, of course, was little kids, hence the proliferation of cartoon matinees and low-budget pulp serials. What about teenagers? Well, Hollywood viewed them as non-existent, because historically they weren't thought of as having the disposable income of their older and younger counterparts. We'll come back to that in a moment, so hold on to it. Anyway, come the 1950s, the rigid adherence to this business model started to bite Hollywood in the ass. With a big assist from the new and rapidly adopted technology of television, TV was capable of beaming safe, agreeable, middlebrow pablum into people's homes for free. Suddenly, you could stay home for your intellectually non-threatening entertainment, which fit right in with post-war America's newfound worship of the insular, home-centric, nuclear family model of proper living. Hollywood's most reliable revenue streams fell off dramatically. Their response? To win people back by making everything bigger. TV might be able to give them a clown, but the movies could give them the whole damn circus. They made movie screens way bigger, and shot expensive widescreen epics to showcase that awesome bigness. They pumped money into productions showcasing giant events and casts of thousands in lavish costumes. They invested in high-tech special effects to bring unreal worlds to life, and played up fancy bonus gimmicks like 3D. Competition from a rival medium? Lavish effects-driven spectacles? Ginormous screens and technical gimmicks?
Does this sound familiar to anyone else?
Now, let's be clear, some really, really good movies and really cool advancements came from this era of Hollywood staving off the inevitable. But it was still inevitable. The mega-productions were producing too many Cleopatra-sized money pits and too few bona fide hits like The Sound of Music. The industry was taking on water and the studio system was sinking fast. And the only thing that might have saved them, they happened upon too late. Remember what I said about teenagers? Well, Hollywood still thought of teens and young adults in a pre-World War II awkward, moneyless non-persons way. But funny thing, it seems that when World War II ended, Mr. and Mrs. American opted to celebrate the old-fashioned way. The really, really old-fashioned way. This produced a population explosion of children all at once that was so huge it was referred to as the baby boom. These so-called baby boomers reached their teens in the early 1960s, having grown up largely in an era of unprecedented American wealth and prosperity, and unlike almost every previous generation of teens, they were able to spend money in a way that made them a viable market force in their own right. They just weren't spending much of it at the movies. See, as a general rule of social history, each new generation rejects, to some degree, the views and social mores of the previous one. Just as the World War II greatest generation had created the consumer-driven economic prosperity of the 50s in part by rejecting the austerity of their own parents, many of the boomers came to reject, however superficially, the materialism and social conservatism of theirs, embracing instead a so-called counterculture of rock music, sexual and chemical experimentation, and radical political movements. While America's more flexibly structured entertainment providers like the music, fashion, art, and literary industries moved quickly and successfully to capitalize on the so-called counterculture, Hollywood couldn't. They took too long to acknowledge it, and their rigidly structured system made a properly timed reaction impossible. Also, you remember that whole movie studios can't control theaters anymore Supreme Court dealie from last time? Well, that had allowed independent filmmakers to get their movies more widely seen, and many of them were cheap enough and, it must be said, exploitative and shameless enough to cash in on the counterculture iconography. Also, foreign films from Europe and Asia, which had evolved on more experimental, risk-taking lines than American film because of the then only just recently abandoned Hays Censorship Code, were frequently found more appealing to the counterculture sensibility. The studios tried to jump onto this bandwagon as the 60s ended and the 70s began, but they blew it. While Columbia had success buying the distribution rights to the drug-fueled biker classic Easy Rider, the success of which was seen as the birth of New Hollywood in 1969, pretty much every attempt after that failed. Disastrous bombs like Zabriskie Point and Myra Breckenridge were embarrassing attempts to pander to the so-called hippies, a movement that was already on its last legs to begin with, and meanwhile they'd all but completely ignored more overall important social movements like civil rights, gay rights, and feminism. Hollywood had become an anachronism, and while there's no specific moment or date for it, it's largely agreed upon that around the dawn of the 70s, the once mighty studio system had completely collapsed. But Tinseltown turned out to be a resilient entity, and Hollywood would soon rise again. For you see, where the old gods had died, the geeks would inherit the earth. As As the 1970s dawned, the American film industry, or rather the once dominant form of the same as typified by the Hollywood studio system, had fallen completely into ruin. Slow to adapt to a changing culture and utterly inept at catching up when they tried. That was the bad news. The good news was that the Hollywood studios were so desperate to stave off Armageddon that they were willing to take unprecedented creative gambles, which allowed a new generation of actors, writers, directors, and producers the opportunity to kick off projects that would have been unthinkable even a decade before. Now, this is going to be a very compressed version of the story. If you're interested in more detail, read the book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls by Peter Biskind. It's a little gossipy, but it's comprehensive. Anyway, one of the byproducts of America's economic prosperity after World War II was that a college education became a mainstream middle-class goal for the first time. In movie industry regions like New York and Los Angeles, film school became a place where young movie buffs could not only learn, but meet, network, and form a pool of emerging talent that the professional movie business couldn't ignore for long. Legendary low-budget renegades like Roger Corman snapped them up and put them to work, and newly humbled Hollywood caught a glimpse of salvation and threw open the doors, while slightly older pros who hadn't quite fit in the old Hollywood like Stanley Kubrick, Sidney Lumet, and Mel Brooks found their careers reinvigorated. Between these two groups, the so-called movie brats and the older one-time misfits, the inmates were suddenly running the asylum, and running it well. When older film critics talk about the 1970s as the last truly great decade of American filmmaking, this is what they're talking about. A once-in-a-lifetime crisis equals opportunity moment where big Hollywood money was being given over to films that pushed the social, cultural, and artistic envelope. Now legendary names like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Woody Allen, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, William Friedkin, Milos Forman, John Borman, Terrence Malick, movies like 2001, Taxi Driver, Five Easy Pieces, Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown, Network, Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, The Graduate, The Exorcist, Serpico, Marathon Man, Annie Hall, American Graffiti, Dog Day Afternoon, Rosemary's Baby, Butch Cassidy. You get the picture. This was a really good run. The studios, still mere shells of their former selves, didn't necessarily have the economic domination back, but for the first time in a long time, film was the dominant, serious narrative medium in American culture. Hollywood had its pride back, and everyone knew they had the movie brats to thank for it. But what happened next, and just how transformative this offbeat collection of film school nerds turned new Hollywood power players turned out to be, nobody could have predicted. What made the film school generation, or movie brats, different was that they were part of the first generation to truly grow up with movies as a constant present in their lives since early childhood. As such, their cinematic vocabulary wasn't just influenced by the classics and art films they'd studied in school, but the fanciful genre films of their childhood and the sleazy drive-in schlock of their teens. And when they began to combine those elements, something totally unexpected happened. Francis Ford Coppola, for a time the nominal leader of the movie brats, mixed lurid B-movie gangster melodrama with old-school Hollywood grandeur to turn Mario Puzo's bloated pulp novel The Godfather into a stunning epic, and when Part 2 turned out to be just as good, overnight the stigma against sequels vanished from Hollywood's consciousness. Steven Spielberg, for a time the untested nerdy new kid of the team, signed on for the adaptation of popular but really not all that good Peter Benchley book about a killer shark, and turned it into a Hitchcockian suspense classic that changed monster movies forever. Then he turned around and did the same damn thing for flying saucers. Hell, in no previous decade would Hollywood have ever spent a fortune making a serious movie about Superman, but in the 70s, they did just that. And all the while, George Lucas, a shy young man with an eye for technology and one of the most experimental visions of the Coppola clique, was pouring blood, sweat, and tears into a bizarre dream project that fused mythic fantasy, samurai melodrama, and pulp sci-fi that was considered so strange, not even most of the other movie brats thought it was going to work. The result was Star Wars. In 1977, Star Wars changed everything. It wasn't just the sheer amount of money that it and the similarly mega-popular Jaws had made, it was the way it spread outward and completely dominated the popular psyche, especially in the once ancillary realm of merchandising. Lucas' Outer Space Flight of Fancy had, without even meaning to, discovered the cash cow secret formula Hollywood had been seeking for decades. High-concept nerd ephemera reconstituted as crowd-pleasing blockbusters. Sadly, it wasn't all good news. The other members of New Hollywood often found themselves unable to bear the weight of their own visions, and expensive bombs like Heaven's Gate and Coppola's own One for the Heart crippled the studio's enthusiasm for director-driven auteur projects. Also, in a note of bitter irony, the financial success of the post-Star Wars blockbusters made Hollywood a popular investment. International conglomerates bought up what remained of the old studios and re-solidified their corporate structure. Hollywood became a company town once again. And that more or less takes us up to the present, or at least close enough that most of us are familiar with. Are you exhausted yet? Well, hold on, because we've still got a few loose ends to tie up next time. crucial fact that must be understood when regarding the popular culture of the early 20th century is that what we think of as mass communication was still a fairly young concept, even in the industrialized world. Thusly, it was still possible for huge segments of a population to be utterly closed off from one another. As such, while aspects of cultural enlightenment and artistic revolutions came into existence gradually in America's more bustling and internationally connected urban cities, the less constantly evolving rural or small-town culture often didn't learn of such leaps forward until they grew so large as to come crashing in all at once like a big surprise. In other words, a recipe for cultural backlash. And this was even before the twin horrors of Nazism and Stalinism scared Western culture back into its shell and set the causes of societal, racial, sexual, and scientific progress back for decades to come, but that's another episode altogether. How does this relate to what we'd been talking about before? Well, although they were run as ruthlessly as any other business at the top, Hollywood, like any other industry connected to the performing arts, was an attractive destination for creative personalities who might not have fit in wherever they'd come from originally. For some, Tinseltown was a place where many of the different could be different in relative safety, so long as their work made money for the studios. And it helped that American moviegoers had developed a guilty pleasure appetite for some of the often scandalous images and themes Hollywood's often scandalous creative class kept putting on screen. While deeply unenlightened in some respects, early Hollywood films frequently pushed societal boundaries of the time to the breaking point. Marlene Dietrich's male drag performance and lesbian kiss in Morocco shocked U.S. audiences, but also made the film into a blockbuster hit. But the party couldn't last. Moral vanguards, religious leaders, and other, delightful folks began to rage against the lurid yet very popular sex and violence emanating from Hollywood, arguing that motion picture technology's unprecedented ability to replicate reality made it a special case for censorship in the interest of the public good. Hey, where have I heard that argument before? Meanwhile, a newly minted industry of tabloid journalists had risen to feed public fascination with bringing movie stars down to earth by publishing exaggerated details of recreational drug use, excessive celebration, and unconventional sexuality among the Hollywood elite that turned so-called Middle America's impression of the film business into something resembling a Sunday school Bible story about evil Babylon. Now, do you recognize this man? If you'd lived in the 1900s, you would have. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was one of the most popular movie comedians of early Hollywood, famous beyond famous in his heyday. But on September 5th, 1921, Fatty attended a hotel party where a troubled aspiring actress named Virginia Rapp became seriously ill, possibly after consuming excess of alcohol. 2 days later, she died in a hospital from a ruptured bladder, which an acquaintance of hers claimed was the result of sexual assault by Fatty Arbuckle. No evidence was ever found to implicate Arbuckle, and many of the witnesses and even prosecutors at his headline-making murder trials were later revealed to have ulterior motives up to and including blackmail. He would ultimately be cleared of all charges and issued a letter of apology, but the scandal dragged on and completely destroyed his career and social life. His marriage ended, his films were stricken from public view. To this day, the scandal itself is the most surviving record that he existed at all. The newspapers of the infamous William Randolph Hearst, in a certain sense the Fox News channel of their day, gleefully fed America's appetite for the Fatty scandal, obsessing over lurid gossip about the case and the purported evils of godless Hollywood, in a manner that amounted to a prolonged public lynching. This and a series of other Hollywood scandals inflated by the media led a public outcry that threatened to bring the specter of government censorship upon the entire film industry. For the studios, there was only one recourse: start policing themselves before the government started doing it for them. As draconian as much of this so-called policing ultimately became, the fact remains that it might have been much, much worse. In any case, the studio's decision was to create a governing entity called the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association, later shortened to the Motion Picture Association of America, that would enforce decency standards onto Hollywood films with a seal of approval. Said standards were collected into a guide known as the Hays Code, named for its founding president, William Harrison Hayes. Adopted in 1930 and all-powerful by 1934, the so-called Hays Code didn't just ban visual content like gore and nudity, both of which had been widespread in Hollywood films before. It also dictated themes. Hollywood movies were suddenly no longer allowed to mock religion or present priests as villains or comic figures. You couldn't show how criminals did their crimes, and if a character was guilty of a crime, even just a moral transgression like, say, adultery, you had to show them being punished for it so the audience would know it was wrong. Homosexuality? Banned. Interracial relationships? Banned. You couldn't even depict a character giving birth or seeming to be pregnant. Some older movies, like King Kong, actually had to be re-edited for later release. Actress Mae West, whose massive popularity was grounded in her sex appeal and edgy double entendre-laced dialogue, was one of many whose career didn't survive in the New Order. While Hollywood's golden age of the 30s and 40s managed to flourish under the code, its restrictions were a big part of what kept the industry from keeping up with the times and ultimately collapsing in the 60s. I'm pretty sure we covered this already. Filmmakers and studios began to actively challenge the code to loosen its rules, and in 1964, Sidney Lumet's film The Pawnbroker became the first film featuring female nudity to receive code approval. The writing was on the wall, and in 1968, Jack Valenti, the new head of the MPAA, moved to dismantle the code and replace it with the vastly less restrictive, though by no means perfect, rating system that's still in effect today. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that covers it. Did not plan for this to end up having as many parts as it did, let me tell you, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Bob, and next time, something not about movies. I promise.